So I want to welcome you all to the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for the International and Area Studies at Yale. I'm Steve Skronik, a professor in political science, and I'm sitting in today for Ian Shapiro, Sterling Professor of Political Science and the Henry Luce Director of the Macmillan Center. Ian is not able to be here today because he's teaching a class, but I'm happy to fill in. We're both delighted to host Susan Dunn as this year's Henry Stimson Lecturer. Susan is the Massachusetts Professor of Humanities at Williams College and the author of a dozen books. These include Jefferson's Second Revolution, the Election Crisis of 1800, Dominion of Memories, Jefferson, Madison, and the Decline of Virginia, Roosevelt's Purge, How FDR Fought to Change the Democratic Party, which won the Henry Adams Prize and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History. It's also written in 1940, FDR, Wilkie, Lindbergh, Hitler, The Election Amid the Storm. She's co-author with James McGregor Burns of the Three Roosevelts, Patrician Leaders Who Transformed America, and she's a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. Professor Dunn is here to give us 3 lectures under the title FDR's Third 100 Days, Preparing for War and Global Leadership, November 1940 to March 1941. The lectures focus on 3 themes. The first, Plan Dog, From Isolation to a Strategy for War. The second, A Declaration of Interdependence, Lend-Lease. The third, Speed and Speed Now, Mobilizing Industry and Labor for War. We'll hear the first of these lectures today, the second tomorrow, the final lecture on Thursday, and we hope you'll come for all 3. The funding for this lecture series comes from an anonymous donor in honor of Henry Stimson, Yale College, 1889, a statesman whose government service culminated with his tenure as Secretary of War during World War II, a fitting connection for this particular lecture series. In 1998, the Macmillan Center, since 1998, the Macmillan Center and Yale University Press have collaborated to bring distinguished diplomats and foreign policy experts to the center to lecture on their books that are published by Yale University Press. Previous Stimson lectures have included Political Order and Changing Societies by Samuel Huntington, Financial Crises and Emerging Markets by Alexander Lamfalussy, Arms and Influence by Thomas Schelling, The Arab Center, The Promise of Moderation by Ambassador Marwan Mashour, Beyond the Democratic Maze by John Dunn, What Happens to National Liberation by Michael Walzer, and The Imprint of Congress by my colleague David Mayhew. I'm very pleased now to introduce Professor Susan Dunn. Susan will give her lecture, and then she would like to entertain questions and comments in the reception.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Professor Skronik. And it's really quite a coincidence that you're here with us today, because I've been thinking an awful lot about your brilliant book, The Politics Presidents Make, and I sure want to know what you think about what happened exactly 1 week ago. And thank you all for coming on this rainy, dark day. Well, it's a great honor for me to participate in the Henry Stimson Lectures in World Affairs, especially because Henry Stimson, FDR's superb Secretary of War, is one of my heroes. And I'm quite sure that Stimson, who was a courageous internationalist and outstanding statesman, would be as sad and disappointed and shell-shocked and heartbroken as many of us are today, that our president-elect has declared himself an opponent of the responsible political and economic internationalist order that has prevailed in the United States since 1945. America's leadership role in that international order has served the interest and prosperity not only of the United States, but of much of the rest of the world. And it has also served the overriding need for peace and for precluding a World War III. Well, I'd like to start my talk today with a study in contrasts, a tale of 2 cities and a tale of 2 worlds. In 1939, President Franklin Roosevelt proposed a 2-year experiment. He wanted to move the date of Thanksgiving up 1 week from the customary last Thursday in November. The point was to help businesses and the economy by extending the lucrative shopping season between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Most states agreed to try the experiment, but the 6 New England states and 11 others refused to go along. The mayor of Plymouth, Massachusetts, where Pilgrims celebrated the first Thanksgiving in 1621, said that we here in Plymouth consider the day sacred. And so, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, on the 4th Thursday in November 1940, 3,000 men, women, and children, many dressed in pilgrim costumes, crowded into Memorial Hall to commemorate the first Thanksgiving in the New World. Local citizens played the parts of Governor William Bradford, Miles Standish, and the Indian king Massasoit, and reenacted 3 scenes from the past: the signing of the Mayflower Compact, that was the first written expression of democratic self-government in America, the landing at Plymouth Rock, and finally, the first Thanksgiving. In the early evening, as they all streamed out of Memorial Hall into the fresh falling snow and wintry stillness of the November dusk, they heard the shouts of newsboys selling the late edition of the Thursday paper. Germany bombs Plymouth. 200 tons of bombs fall on Plymouth. For 8 hours, the Nazi Luftwaffe dumped its lethal cargo of bombs on the British port city of Plymouth on the English Channel. 150 German planes battered the town and its harbor, destroying warehouses, Navy supply depots, freight yards, railway lines, and especially blocking the harbor so that new shipments of armaments couldn't arrive. The Nazi goal was not only to reduce to rubble and flames important military and industrial targets, but also to break Britain's morale by depositing hell upon its people. Exactly 2 weeks earlier, the Luftwaffe had indiscriminately dropped even more explosives and incendiary bombs upon the ancient Midland city of Coventry, destroying not only automobile and airplane factories, but also residential and business areas, hospitals, power lines, and Coventry's majestic medieval cathedral. A New York Herald Tribune reporter wrote that Coventry has become, and I quote, "the voiceless symbol of the insane, unfathomable barbarity which has been released on Western civilization." After that attack, the Nazis threatened to systematically Coventryize the whole British island. When the minister of the First Church in Plymouth, Massachusetts, heard the news of the bombing in Plymouth, England, he immediately sent a telegram to his English brethren. "Your sorrows are our sorrows," he wrote. "Your battles are our battles. From Plymouth, Massachusetts to Plymouth, England, fight on. Godspeed." Here in the United States, on FDR's earlier Thanksgiving Day, people watched parades and attended church services, enjoyed turkey dinners, played football, and when they all got home, they turned on the lights, they laughed, and slept safely and peacefully in their beds. The president's decision to move Thanksgiving up 1 week did indeed give a big boost to consumer spending. But for the British people and for people around the world, November 1940 was a lousy month and a test of their very survival. In the 3 talks that I'll give this week, I want to make the argument that the several months beginning with Roosevelt's re-election in early November 1940 and ending with his signing of the Lend-Lease Act in early March 1941 marked the start of the country's intervention in World War II. I call this period FDR's third 100 days. It constituted one of the most productive and crucial periods in his long presidency, and perhaps in the 20th century too. It was the administration's covert declaration of war. At his first inauguration in March 1933, on a grim, overcast day in the dark depths of the Great Depression, FDR took the oath of office and then addressed the vast crowd outside the Capitol. After making his unforgettable statement that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he said, "This nation calls for action, and action now." That speech signaled the period that historians call the first 100 days. During those first few months of his administration, FDR enacted important economic and social policies that restored solvency to banks and imposed sweeping regulations on the financial system, extended relief to farmers, constructed power plants in the Tennessee Valley, and provided jobs to millions of the unemployed through the Public Works Administration. Historians have named the summer of 1935 Roosevelt's second 100 days. During this period, FDR swung more to the left and signed some of the most transforming and enduring social programs of the New Deal. Social Security, the National Labor Relations Act that guaranteed the right of workers to organize in unions and engage in collective bargaining, a Revenue Act that lowered taxes on small businesses and increased taxes on large inheritances, and the Works Progress Administration that gave millions of meaningful jobs to American workers and young people, as well as to artists, musicians, actors, and directors. On November 5th, 1940, when the president was elected to an unprecedented third term, he wasn't faced with an economic crisis or for calls for more jobs and security. This time, he was faced with a global military, political, and moral crisis. At stake was not just the economic and social well-being of Americans. At stake was the fate of free and democratic governments everywhere in the world, and the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Judeo-Christian morality, along with the Enlightenment principles of freedom under law, individual rights, and due process, all trembled on the brink of annihilation. In Asia, Japan had wrapped its tentacles deeper into China. In Europe, all the democracies except Great Britain had fallen to Nazi Germany's tanks and planes. Hitler's relentless aggression had transformed the continent of Europe into one huge prison house. In my talks this week, I'll explain the pivotal programs and the crucial strategic plans that Roosevelt initiated and supported during his third 100 days. Today, I'll speak about three things. First, the nation's shift and Roosevelt's shift away from isolationism. Second, Plan Dog. Has anybody ever heard of Plan Dog? I don't know anyone who has. You have? Plan Dog is the strategic plan that outlined American priorities and goals if the United States entered the war. And third, the American-British conversations, the ABC talks, that gave the two countries a forum to coordinate strategy. Tomorrow, I'll speak about the Lend-Lease Act that provided planes, ships, and tanks to Great Britain free of charge and free of strings, and that Prime Minister Winston Churchill called the most unsordid act in the whole of recorded history. And on Thursday, I'll discuss the roles that labor, management, and government played in putting the nation's entire economy and industrial production on a wartime basis. In November 1940, Roosevelt was not yet fully engaged in the urgency of the world crisis. There was no disguising his ambivalence about American involvement in the war. He understood that the U.S. needed more time to rearm, and he was reluctant to move too far ahead of public opinion. During the first few weeks after his election victory, his indecision created the sense of a government adrift. He was weary after the campaign, and he spent much of those post-election weeks reading, cruising, fishing, discussing, and reflecting. But by mid-December, he had all but abandoned that ambivalence. The decisions and plans that were made during Roosevelt's third 100 days constituted a forward move away from the isolationism that had shaped American foreign policy since the end of World War I. And it signaled a new awareness that the United States had to play a defining political, military, and moral role in international affairs. And in fact, it was two of your fellow Yaleys who urged Americans to embrace that international awareness. In February 1941, while Congress was considering the Lend-Lease Act, a 1920 Yale graduate named Henry Luce, I think we're in Luce Hall right now, a 1920 Yale graduate named Henry Luce published an article in Life magazine entitled The American Century. Luce had been the managing editor of the Yale Daily News and was now the influential publisher of Life, Time, and Fortune. In his article, the media mogul scolded Americans for failing, and I quote, to play their part as a world power, a failure that has had disastrous consequences for themselves and for all mankind. Luce called on his own Republican Party to cleanse itself of what he labeled the virus of isolationist sterility. And he called on his fellow citizens to recognize and act on their moral obligation to other nations. He wrote that it was time for America to reconceive its global role and destiny. Another Yale graduate, Henry Stimson, class of 1889, was also a strong internationalist. He was a lifelong Republican who had served as President William Howard Taft's Secretary of War and Herbert Hoover's Secretary of State before becoming FDR's Secretary of War. Stimson adamantly rejected the ostrich-like isolationism that had swept over the country, and like Luce, he urged the United States to accept its vital obligation to always think and act with a sense of planetary responsibility. He wrote that every policy in America, whether private or public, must be framed with reference to the world. Otherwise, he said, it is framed with perfect futility. But before Yaleys get too excited about their wonderful alums, let me remind them that the most powerful and influential isolationist movement began at Yale in the spring of 1940. Yale students Douglas Stewart, the son of a vice president of Quaker Oats, Gerald Ford, the future president, Potter Stewart, the future Supreme Court justice, a senior named Kingman Brewster, and others drafted a petition that stated, "We demand that Congress refrain from war, even if England is on the verge of defeat." Their naive solution to the crisis lay in a negotiated peace with Hitler. Eventually, wealthy Chicago industrialists funded the movement and turned it into the America First Committee. The AFC's charismatic spokesman would be the heroic aviator Charles Lindbergh. From 1939 to 1941, a ferocious debate raged in the United States about American foreign policy. It was a bitter, divisive clash between isolationists and interventionists that tore apart families and friends, churches, universities, and political parties. Let me sketch out for you who these isolationists were. Many were probably well-meaning, although I'm not sure. They were deeply scarred by the memories of the pointless mass slaughter, trench warfare, and poison mustard gas of the First World War. Their determination to retreat from foreign affairs had been emboldened by the 1934 Senate committee hearings chaired by Republican Gerald Nye of North Dakota that sought to investigate whether bankers and profit-seeking munitions makers had played a role in propelling the nation into that First World War. Most isolationists agreed with Charles Lindbergh that the United States was protected by two vast oceans and was therefore invulnerable to any attack. They rejected the idea that the security of the United States hinged on the fate of Great Britain, and they were willing to come to terms with Hitler. And many of them had been persuaded by Lindbergh that the Germans had made such great advances in aviation technology that Germany was invincible. And still other isolationists maintained that democracy in the United States was fragile and couldn't survive another war. And still others were anti-Semitic and cheered Lindbergh when he declared, at an America First rally, and I quote, "The leaders of the British and Jewish races, for reasons which are not American, wished to involve us in the war." And when he warned against Jewish ownership and influence in what he referred to as our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. And some isolationists drank the Kool-Aid and embraced the idea of an Aryan master race. Here's Lindbergh on the radio in 1939. "Our bond with Europe is a bond of race and not of political ideology. Racial strength is vital, politics a luxury." Eugenicists like Lindbergh's mentor Alexis Carrel deployed their pseudo-scientific theories to support the idea that Germany was protecting Europe against racially inferior Slavs, Asians, and of course, Jews. And some isolationists were simply pro-fascist. For example, Lindbergh's wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh. At the height of the 1940 election season, she published an elegant lyrical book called The Wave of the Future that jumped to the top of the bestseller list. From the outside, it looked like a lovely apple, but it was rotten to the core. Building on the pro-fascist writings of Lawrence Dennis, a Harvard graduate who was known as the brains of American fascism, Anne Lindbergh argued that the conflict taking place in Europe between democratic and fascist nations was not between good and evil, but rather between the forces of the past and those of the future. Democracy, it was so clearly and sadly inefficient, exhausted, and outmoded. The future belonged to the dynamism and energy of a dazzling fascist world order, and there's no point in resisting the wave of the future. And some isolationists were Christian pacifists. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr struggled to awaken them to the futility of pacifism. He asked, how could a true Christian conscience not recoil from Hitler's tyrannical goal of destroying the precious heritage of Christian humanistic culture? As for those Christians who didn't understand the urgency and necessity of a just war against Hitler, Niebuhr recommended that they retire to a monastery, where, he said, medieval perfectionists found their asylum. And finally, of course, some isolationists simply hated Roosevelt. For them, the aim was to defeat not Hitler, but FDR, and using isolationism as their sledgehammer. All these currents made up the potent and virulent opposition to any policy that would lead the United States nearer to intervention in the war. And Roosevelt, as the leader of a democratic republic, was indeed constrained by public opinion and had no choice but to be sensitive to the will of the majority. Otherwise, democracy would disintegrate. The European dictators used compulsion, but FDR had to rely on education and the art of persuasion. Now let's return to the wonderful Yale alum, Henry Stimson. In June 1940, he spoke during the Yale commencement weekend about the grave crisis facing the United States, the greatest crisis in the nation's history. He told students and alumni, and I quote, "The international emergency strikes at the very existence of all that our country has cherished and fought for since its founding." And then he offered 3 concrete proposals: repeal of the Misguided Neutrality Act, the sending of planes and other munitions immediately to Britain, and closest to his heart, universal compulsory military service. After his talk, all those at the meeting, including Yale President Charles Seymour, voted unanimously for a resolution advocating a military draft. In 1915, before the U.S. entered World War I, he was among the first to enroll in something called the Businessmen's Military Training Camp in Plattsburgh, New York. It was a volunteer movement of college graduates who believed in military preparedness. When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, Stimson was already 50 years old, but he volunteered to serve in the Army and reached the rank of colonel. During the 1930s, the decade of open German, Italian, and Japanese aggression, he gave talks and wrote articles condemning isolationism. A few days after Stimson's speech at Yale in June 1940, President Roosevelt phoned him and asked him to be his new Secretary of War. The 72-year-old Stimson had one question for the president. Did he know about the talk he had just given at Yale? Yes, FDR said. He indeed had read the text of the speech, and he agreed with it. Stimson was particularly pleased that his talk here in New Haven had put him on the record as a staunch interventionist. There was no doubt about Stimson's contempt for isolationism at his Senate confirmation hearings. He told the members of the Military Affairs Committee that at a time of unprecedented peril, he couldn't understand, as he put it, the hopelessly twisted views of a small group of men who, in the name of peace, want to keep America from acting against the greatest aggression in history. He scorned the notion that the nation could rely on purely passive defense, and he ridiculed the idea of waiting for the enemy to attack our shores. In fact, Stimson's interventionist views were far stronger than Roosevelt's. The president had brought into his inner circle a man who would try to push him toward a path he was reluctant to take. In Stimson's amazingly detailed and informative diary, which is available online, he described his frustration with his elusive commander-in-chief. In December 1940, he wrote that the president, I quote, hops around in his discussions from suggestion to suggestion, and it's very much like chasing a vagrant beam of sunshine around a vacant room. That portrait of Roosevelt was quite accurate. For years, the president had equivocated and fluctuated in response to fascist aggression. In the fall of 1937, after the Japanese launched a brutal incursion into China, Roosevelt gave a speech in Chicago saying that the United States could no longer hide from international lawlessness through isolation or neutrality. He called for democratic nations to quarantine the aggressors. But what exactly did quarantine mean? He proposed no plan, no economic sanctions, or any other type of coercion. On the contrary, he made it clear that the U.S. would not go beyond expressing moral indignation. In September 1939, when German troops took over Poland, Roosevelt stayed on the sidelines. In a fireside chat a few days later, he assured Americans that the United States would remain a neutral nation. He admitted that he didn't expect Americans to close their minds or their consciences to Nazi brutality, but he also confessed his deep antipathy to war. I hate war, he said. As long as it remains within my power to prevent it, there will be no blackout of peace in the United States. But in the late spring of 1940, the situation changed dramatically. The Nazis' swift march of victory through Western Europe had left Great Britain standing alone as the last European bastion against Germany. Roosevelt requested billions of dollars from Congress for the expansion of the Army and the Navy. And that fall, he signed the Selective Service Act, authorizing the first peacetime draft in American history. In addition, in a clear break from neutrality, he gave Britain 50 World War I destroyers in exchange for a 99-year lease for British naval and air bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, and the Caribbean. That famous destroyers for bases deal was actually an idea first proposed by Henry Luce when he dined with Roosevelt that past July at the White House. Of course, events created new pressures. In September 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the tripartite pact. And 2 weeks later, FDR gave a strongly worded Columbus Day talk. He declared that no combination of dictator countries in Europe and Asia will halt us in the path we see ahead for ourselves and for democracy. But there were counter pressures too. Above all, Roosevelt's campaign for re-election at a time when the voting public was anxious about the prospect of war. In campaign speeches that October, the third-term candidate bowed down before a new god, the god of no foreign war. It must have been bewildering for the crowd in Madison Square Garden to hear the president praise the Neutrality Act that he had bitterly criticized and opposed in 1935 and 1936. And in Boston, a week before the election, American mothers and fathers listened intently as he made an emotional pledge. "I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." In the back of his mind, Roosevelt reasoned that if the United States was attacked, it would no longer be a foreign war. And rather than risk losing the election, he made promises that were unrealistic at best. In his struggle to stake out a politically safe middle ground between war and isolation, Roosevelt frequently emphasized the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 and the importance of defense of the Western Hemisphere. This was an uncontroversial stance that was unlikely to infuriate internationalists or to alienate isolationists, for they all considered the Americas as their domain. I think it was impossible to find in all this a coherent U.S. position on the world conflict. Roosevelt was offering confusing messages of military preparedness, increased defense spending and production, defiance of the Axis powers, assurances of neutrality, promises of no war, and hemispheric defense. But there was one unstated constant, Roosevelt's bottom line. Whatever the peril, he was not going to lead the country into war. He was going to wait to be pushed in. But Henry Stimson didn't want to wait until the country was pushed into war. He wanted the president to lead and not merely follow public opinion. And Stimson wasn't alone. He was a member of a brilliant quartet that included Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, FDR's new Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and Admiral Harold Stark, the Naval Chief of Operations. Amid mounting signs that the United States might soon be at war, the four decided to act and steer the hesitant president toward intervention. They understood that the Army, Navy, and Air Force needed an overarching grand strategic plan to meet future contingencies. They agreed that it was absolutely essential to determine what the nation's core priorities were, whether to take the offensive in the Atlantic or in the Pacific, whether to defeat Germany first or Japan. In the early fall of 1940, General Marshall briefly and succinctly outlined the essence of what would become the overriding goal of American strategy. 1. Our national interest is the survival of the British Empire and the defeat of Germany. 2. We must avoid dispersions that might lessen our power to operate effectively in the principal theater, the Atlantic. In other words, as Marshall straightforwardly wrote, if we lose in the Atlantic, we lose everywhere. Marshall believed that the United States was already overextended in the Pacific. He told Admiral Stark, and I quote, "A serious commitment in the Pacific is just what Germany would like to see us undertake." Stark, Stimson, and Knox all agreed with Marshall on an Atlantic-first strategy. Stark warned that if Britain fell to the Nazis, we would find ourselves acting alone and at war with the world. But America's priorities and goals needed to be codified or formalized so that the Army and Navy chiefs had a well-defined blueprint for how to achieve the paramount goal, as well as a solid basis for coordinating their planning. And so in the late fall of 1940, Admiral Stark decided to compose an analysis of the situation for his colleagues and for the President. In the quiet of his home, he worked for 18 straight hours on a draft of just such a blueprint. With military concision, he methodically assessed the international situation, laid out several scenarios based on different objectives, and articulated what he and the other members of the quartet believed was America's prime objective. Finally, he weighed the country's capabilities in light of that objective, taking into account not only the level of the military's readiness, but also what he called the political realities in our own country. His aim, he unpretentiously told Frank Knox, was merely to shed some light upon the major decisions that the President may make for guiding our future military and naval efforts in the event of a war and in further immediate preparations for war. It was a very humble goal for a document that outlined the course that the United States would follow for the next 5 years through the utterly unforeseeable events of the most destructive war in human history. Stark wrote his report himself on an ancient device, technically known as a manual typewriter. It was double-spaced and 26 pages long, written in non-aggressive, everyday language. On the first page, he explained that his intention was to present his views concerning steps we might take to meet the situation that will exist if the United States enters the war, either alone or with allies. And then he posed the crucial question, where should we fight the war and for what objective? And he offered 4 different scenarios. Plan A proposed that the United States maintain a purely defensive posture in the Western Hemisphere and avoid any involvement in the war for as long as possible. Neither in the East nor the West would we do anything more than provide material help to America's allies. It was a plan that would do nothing extraordinary to aid Britain, even though the quartet believed that the survival of Britain was essential to European security. Stark's Plan B laid out a strictly defensive posture in the Atlantic, but a full offensive against Japan in the Pacific. He explained that this option placed full confidence in the British to hold their own indefinitely in the Atlantic, while the US would focus on defeating Japan. But he also proposed that if Great Britain was losing in its struggle against Nazi Germany, the US would have to immediately reorient toward the Atlantic. Here comes Plan C. This was the nightmare scenario. It envisaged a 2-front war, with the US sending the strongest possible military assistance to Britain as well as to the Far East. The handicap of fighting 2 major wars in 2 theaters at the same time was, of course, mind-boggling. Stark acknowledged that such a 2-front war would disperse US forces and virtually preclude successful operations in either theater. The last scenario was Plan D. It had the United States directing its efforts toward a strong offensive in the Atlantic as an ally of Britain, while maintaining only a defensive position against Japan in the Pacific. Plan D stipulated that if the United States was forced into a war with Japan, it would still avoid major operations in the Pacific until the Atlantic front and Britain were entirely secure. Of course, circumstances would ultimately determine American actions. But taking all probable factors into account, Stark firmly recommended that the Roosevelt administration adopt Plan D. He rejected the other options as counterproductive, and he gave 4 reasons why. First, The secure existence of Britain and its empire would do the most to ensure the security of the United States and the Western Hemisphere. Second, it was Germany, and not Japan, that most seriously threatened Britain's security and even its survival. Third, therefore, it was Germany that also posed the greatest danger to the security of the United States. And finally, four, Stark wrote that in the interest of American and British security, America's full offensive strength must be exerted in one single direction, an Atlantic first and a defeat Germany strategy. The adoption of Plan Dog, or Plan D, or Plan Dog, as it was called in naval parlance, would mean that the fate of the United States would be inextricably bound to that of Britain, that we would do everything we could to meet Britain's vital needs, and that American soldiers might have to fight in a land war in Europe. While Roosevelt was promising that your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars, Admiral Stark was already envisioning American participation in a full-scale land offensive in Europe. Of course, Stark knew that the United States was still building up its own military strength and wasn't yet ready to engage in offensive actions. And so he advised that for the very near future, Roosevelt adopt Plan A, hemispheric defense with only material aid to the Allies. Roosevelt's response to the Plan Dog memorandum was something of a mystery. He never signaled outright approval, but he also gave no sign of disapproval. And so Marshall, Stimson, Knox, and Stark adopted the Atlantic First strategy because the president didn't say they couldn't. FDR's tacit acquiescence left the quartet free to conclude that military strategy would be left to the leaders of the military. The credit goes to Admiral Stark. It was he who seized the initiative and fought to bring order and coherence to what had been a muddle. And above all, it was he who drafted a plan that was true to both the shape of the world crisis and to the potential leadership role of the United States. Even though in 1942 and most of 43, more American forces were in fact deployed against Japan than against Germany, Plan Dog nevertheless defined America's paramount wartime strategy and goals. In fact, it was the fundamental U.S. strategic decision of the war. Now, with the goal of defending Britain and defeating Germany, how would the Americans and the British coordinate their planning and their actions? The last crucial recommendation in Stark's memo was that members of the American military senior staff hold secret talks that winter in Washington with their British counterparts as a preliminary to possible American entry into the war. General Marshall completely agreed with the necessity of such meetings. After the war, he wrote, "If we hadn't had some talks with the British, we would have started with no basis at all if we entered the war. We needed to have at least a vague idea of what we could expect from the British and what sort of help they would want from us." Another reason for proposing joint talks was that both Marshall and Stark had serious misgivings about the competence of British military leaders. In fact, they feared that the American military effort would be sabotaged by British ineptitude and miscalculation. Ironically, Prime Minister Churchill had no objections to the low opinion that America's top military officers held of the fitness of the British for battle. The Prime Minister reasoned that the more floundering that Britain appeared, the more likely it was that the United States would rush to her aid. Churchill wrote that it was particularly helpful that American military leaders considered Britain incapable of winning alone. Roosevelt approved the talks but demanded that they be kept absolutely secret. one of his advisors commented that if the Germans and Japanese had learned of the talks, no great damage would have been done, because they would have expected as much. But had the isolationists in Congress found out, then American preparations for war might have been wrecked. Roosevelt began a mid-January meeting at the White House with Marshal Stimson, Knox, and Stark by soberly laying out the very grave situation. He said that there was one chance in 5 that Germany would invade Britain immediately, in which case Britain might survive for 6 months at best. He emphasized the importance of keeping the British supplied with all they needed, even in the event of an Axis attack on the United States. The US, he said, would simply have to be ready to act with what we have available. Then he outlined the position he wanted the Americans to take at the joint talks. In other words, these were their marching orders. 1, we would stand on the defensive in the Pacific with the fleet based on Hawaii. 2, the Navy should be prepared to convoy shipping in the Atlantic to England. 3, the Army should not engage in offensive action until it was fully prepared. 4, our military course must be conservative until our strength is fully developed. 5, we will make every effort to supply war material to Great Britain. This was Admiral Stark's memorandum in a nutshell. Roosevelt didn't mention Plan Dog by name, but his directions could be interpreted as a comprehensive endorsement. On January 24, 1941, the Royal Navy ship King George V arrived in Chesapeake Bay. Newspapers reported that on board was the new British ambassador to the US, Lord Halifax. But they didn't report that also arriving were representatives of the British Chiefs of Staff. They were camouflaged in civilian clothes, and their assignment was to participate in high-level confidential discussions with their American counterparts to create a joint strategy for war. 5 days later, the American-British Conversations, or ABC, got underway and would continue for 2 months until the end of March. The Americans opened the conversations with a statement of the U.S. position. At the present time, the United States would remain out of the war, but it would provide all material and economic aid to Great Britain. But if the United States was compelled to resort to war, it was committed to the defeat of Germany and to an Atlantic First strategy. The U.S. was also committed to the containment of Japan. But even if it had to conduct military operations against Japan, it would limit those operations so as not to diminish America's main effort in the Atlantic. It was once again Plan Dog in a nutshell. The British accepted nearly all of the American statement and goals, especially the #1 priority of defeating Germany. But they clashed over Britain's determination to maintain control over its global empire and protect its interests in the Far East, from India and Burma to Australia and New Zealand. The British representatives at the ABC talks believed that the defense of those interests hinged entirely on their naval base in Singapore, and that the loss of Singapore would be a disaster. The bottom line was that the British wanted the Americans to send a fleet to Singapore. But the Americans didn't want to do the dirty work of salvaging the British Empire. And so the subject of Singapore provoked a bitter stalemate in the talks. When Prime Minister Churchill heard about his staff's intransigent position on Singapore, he blew his stack. What has been the use Well, I wish I could say this with his accent. I can't. What has been the use of all this battling, he said. Our sole object is to get the Americans into the war. If they prefer Hawaii to Singapore, there is no more to be said. Despite this conflict and other clashes, the talks brought substantial agreements. Britain was assured of American help in the Atlantic, and there was no argument about the importance of defeating Nazi Germany first. The Brits accepted that the American presence in the Pacific would remain a defensive one, with its main fleet stationed in Hawaii as a deterrent to Japanese aggression. The ABC talks were a clear win for the United States. But above all, Plan Dog had become and would remain the operative strategy for the United States and for Britain. One senior British staff member called it the Bible of our joint collaboration, and not even Pearl Harbor would change that. We know that disputes between Britain and the United States over strategic policy would continue. The two countries would calculate and plot their decisions according to their own national and imperial interests. And once Americans were in the war, Churchill would not always be as yielding as he was during the ABC talks. But the talks had created a partnership that could withstand the bitterest of disagreements to come, and that would soon evolve into permanent joint military and naval missions in London and Washington, with staffs numbering in the hundreds. For his part, Winston Churchill was elated about the new era that was dawning. After the war, he wrote, "We were conscious of the tremendous changes taking place in American opinion, and of the growing belief, not only in Washington, but throughout the country, that their fate was bound up with ours." And in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, the new Anglo-American alliance was indestructibly anchored on both sides of the Atlantic. I'll conclude by saying that although the United States remained at the moment in a gray area, neither at peace nor at war, Plan Dog and the ABC talks demonstrate that in late 1940 and early 41, despite all his caution, Roosevelt grasped the likely course of events. And thanks to prodding by Marshall, Stimson, Knox, and Stark, he approved crucial preparations for war. During his third 100 days, he made no public declaration of his intentions or his thoughts about the inevitability of American involvement in the global conflict. But plans for war were now unmistakably and irrevocably underway. Thank you.